another question popped in, but I think you can answer it along with this one. It says, so what do you mean by 3-minute exposures for 2.5 hours, and how did you stack your picture?
Okay, I'm gonna get into the stacking. Well, let me go ahead and answer that. I think I get into a little bit. There are a couple of well, as you know, in photography, there are 100 ways to do the same thing. So the one you can stack in Photoshop. You can process all your images in Lightroom, get them to where you want them exactly, export them. As you could export them all as layers. Now that's obviously you start to get into some big processing. So this was so what was that? 2.5 hours. So that is what 100 and or 2.25 hours. So 140 minutes at 3 minutes each. So that's what 70, 60 some images. So you're going to export those. You could export, matter of fact, I think I did export all of those as a layer, as layers to Photoshop. Then in Photoshop, you just change your blending layers to lighten, and that generally will give you that star trail. You can watch it. You can watch it all blend in, and with each exposure that you add as a layer and add as lighten, it only brings the illumination of the next images from the stars. So it brightens up the dark sky with the star trail. So that's how you get to star trails. Now there's also a program called for Windows, it's called Sequator, and for Mac, it's called Starry Landscape Stacker. And I've got that. I go over that here in a minute. But those are also two independent programs I use a lot, and they can be used for stacking star trails. You maybe have seen a movie where they show you the progression of the star trail as it builds. That can be done with those programs, Sequator and Starry Landscape Stacker.
Okay, so when you're saying 3 minutes, do you expose for 3 minutes and then it takes 3-minute segments?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just if you have and I mean, I know so many cameras differ on whether they have an internal intervalometer. I had a Sony at one time, and it had a beautiful intervalometer in its firmware, in its software. Canon, it's very frustrating with Canon. They changed the intervalometer from. I have a dedicated astro camera. This is the Canon RA, officially for astronomy. It does not have an internal intervalometer that will go beyond, that'll use bulb exposure. I could say take 100 pictures at 3 minutes. I can't do that. I'm limited to a 30-second exposure on this, and I believe the Canon RP. So I have to use an external intervalometer to control my camera to get an exposure above 30 seconds. But you're just going to have to check all your own individual cameras for what your capabilities are with your intervalometer, and you may have to get a third party or an external intervalometer to get to those type of exposure times. Now, having said that, the only reason I went with 3 minutes is to minimize the number of exposures, okay? You could use 30 seconds. You could use a higher ISO. You could use a 3200 ISO or a 6400 ISO for 30 seconds and take 300 of those. Again, you're going from 70 images to 300. So that's the trade-off, is you could stick with your maximum manual exposure time of 30 seconds, but you're going to have more images. And then it just starts to become storage and image processing and whatever software app you choose to go with. So as always, I know, isn't this crazy? This is astrophotography. We take 100 images to get one. So. Anything else, Pam?
I think we're good now.
Okay, now, so the second category we want to talk about is Milky Way or stars in the landscape. And I'm going to save everybody a lot of time, and I'm going to point you to the guru of this technique. And if you don't know about him, I highly encourage you. He is a great instructor. He's on YouTube. His name is Richard Taddy. He's from Australia. His marketing is called Nightscape Images. And if you don't get anything out of what I'm saying tonight, and you would like to pursue this as a technique, I highly encourage you. He has tutorials. They're all free. They're on YouTube. He's fantastic. So what are we going to talk about here? I'm going to get back down to talking about exposure time. Remember, I was doing that 3 minute for the star trail only to minimize files. So when you're trying to capture the Milky Way in the landscape, or stars in the landscape, our goal for the most part is to make the stars look like points of light, like they truly are. So to do that, you have to minimize your star trails with your tripod exposure. Now, many people will quote the 500 rule, and maybe you know what the 500 rule is, but basically you're just dividing the focal length of your lens into 500, and that tells you how many seconds of exposure to use. I like using 250. I think 500 is a little too liberal. You do get star trails, especially if you start to zoom in and you want to blow up the image for a print. I use 250 to determine my exposure time. So let's get into some of this. So if I had a 20 millimeter lens here, and I do the 250 rule, 12.5 seconds is the maximum exposure I should use to, in most situations, to not have a visible star trail in the stars. The stars will mostly look like points of light. What you want to do here is balance, so your time of exposure is going to be fixed, and then you're going to work with your ISO to really get your histogram off that left edge as best as possible. So make sure you're checking that full RGB histogram, not just your monochrome histogram. I typically stack anywhere from 5 to 10 images. So if I'm doing a 12.5 second exposure, now we're talking about maybe a minute of exposure. So we're minimizing the amount of movement in the sky for that whole minute. Most of the software can deal with that, but it keeps everything nice and tight and tidy. And I'll show you an example here in a minute. Now, again, we're back to talking about Sequator, which is a free software program. This does the stacking of the stars in the sky and freezes the ground. It's amazing. You do have to select the sky before, and this is beyond a tutorial on how to use Sequator, but it's the software to use. It freezes your foreground and yet lets you stack images in the sky to, what are we doing? We're improving our signal to noise ratio, minimizing the noise in the sky by stacking 5, 10 images. So find a compelling foreground to either light paint or frame in a silhouette. Again, that crescent moon could be your best friend here. It could light the foreground for you. Use your widest aperture possible, balancing that edge quality of the lens versus the signal gathering that you're going to get. If your fastest lens is 2.8, give it a try. I have to tell you, stars and astrophotography are the toughest test for a lens. A lens could look amazing in a landscape or portrait scenario, but stars on the edge can look like seagulls or even worse. And depending on how far out or how close in it becomes, this starts to get into coma. You start to get into astigmatism. Obviously, you can get into aberrations. So you can control some of the color chromatic aberration in your post-processing with Lightroom. It does a pretty nice job. When you have purple halos or blue halos around stars, don't always check your manual correction option in Lightroom, because you'll have that slider, and for me, it's generally like a quantity of 8. Really takes care of those blue halos without, most of my astronomy pictures don't have a lot of blue. Blue's reflection nebula, other than what is, I tend to like my night sky to be a little bit blue, just a deep blue. So that goes a little bit deeper than what I wanted to here. But use the widest aperture example. And so let me go to a couple of examples on my website. So this is under my Astroscape section. I tend to put all of my kind of a landscape. So here's one, no light painting, but you can't discount the amount of light that is coming from the Milky Way either, and the stars. And this rock, Seneca Rock, is very reflective. Now, also in this valley, there is a Yoakum's Hotel and gas station. And that's what this light is. It lights up this valley from a gas station down here on the corner. So this is, I think I stacked 5 images, probably around 13 seconds with the 14mm f2.8. It's a tripod-based shot. And this is the Milky Way rising over Seneca Rocks. No light painting. And then now a light painting example I have is I went out to Death Valley, and this is Rhyolite Bank outside of Death Valley National Park. So I just light painted this, probably took 5 separate exposures and layered them all together, and then of course layered the Milky Way exposure in on top of that. So this is probably a combination of about 10 exposures, probably 5 for the sky, 5 for the light painting here, and you just have to walk around. The light painting can be done. You can stop the lens down. I don't want to get into all that. Go to that Richard Taddy YouTube, and he covers all of this about light painting. But I want you just to think this is a technique to maybe employ. That's a great technique. I'm still working on this, getting better at it, but this is a fantastic, I love this technique when it's done right. It looks beautiful. And you can do this in a lot of different lighting situations.